Worst episode title ever, but let's go with it. I wanted to revisit something that we first discussed way back in episode 8 in season 1. I've referenced episode 8 a bunch of times on this channel. I quite like that episode. It's one of my favorite episodes. We covered a lot of good information in that episode about word order changes in German subordinate sentence clauses. And I stand by everything I said in that episode, but it turns out that that episode is not complete. There's an exception to one of the rules that I went over in that episode that I didn't know at the time that I filmed episode 8. So I thought we could do a little follow-up episode, an addendum episode, if you will, to episode 8 to cover that new information. So here's what we're going to do on this beautiful afternoon. We're going to do a review of episode 8. I'll try to keep it brief, and then we're going to cover the new information. If you want to skip the review and go right to the good stuff, go to this time code on the screen right now. Otherwise, we'll start with reviewing what we covered first in episode 8. So, German word order is a bit wonky coming from English. Or perhaps English word order is a bit wonky coming from German. It depends on your perspective. I guess it's all relative. In simple sentences with only one verb, German word order can be identical to English. So let's start with a simple sentence and we'll build it up as we go through this episode. I see it. Subject, verb, object. Great. In German, that's ich sehe es. The verb goes in position 2, and everything is exactly as you would expect it to be. But things get a little weird when we start adding verbs to that clause, to that sentence. Let's add a modal verb to that sentence. In English, I can see it. Can, the modal verb, modifies the main verb see, and you'll notice that in English, those verbs stick together rather stubbornly. The only thing that comes between them is the word not if you negate that sentence. I cannot see it or I can't see it. Great, but the modal verb and the main verb stick together. Not so in German. In German, it's the opposite. The modal verb pushes the main verb, the verb that it's modifying, away from it. It pushes it to the end of the sentence clause and reconjugates it back to the full infinitive. We don't do this in English, so it's very odd when you come to this for the first time. So I can see it in German is ich kann es sehen. Literally, I can it to see, which we don't do in English. Now it gets a little weirder. If we add another verb to the sentence, let's say an auxiliary verb, in English, let's say I will be able to see it. Be able to is the same verb as can. It changes form a little bit there. But we end up with 3 verbs, and note that they all stick together, back to back to back. We stick with subject, verb, object in English, as we normally do. Or I guess subject, verb, 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 object, but never mind. Not so in German. In German, we end up with ich werde es sehen können. What happens there is that can, the modal verb, pushes sehe to the end, reconjugates it back to the full infinitive, and then werde, the auxiliary verb, pushes can to the end and reconjugates it back to the full infinitive können. And it happens in that order. So when you see a pile of verbs at the end of a German sentence, you kind of read them right to left. Sehen können is can see or be able to see. Okay, that's very wonky coming from English, but that's okay. You get used to it over time. Now, what happens if I take that sentence and use it as a subordinate clause? There's another kind of verb push that can happen in German. This is what we covered in episode 8. So let's divide it into 2 types of verb pushing that can happen in German sentences. There's probably a formal linguistic term for these, but let's just call them verb push type 1 and verb push type 2. Type 1 is what we just saw. A modal verb or an auxiliary verb pushes the verb that it modifies to the end of the sentence clause and reconjugates it back to the full infinitive. So, ich kann sehe es is how you want to say it in German, because that's how we say it in English, but no, can pushes sehe to the end and it becomes sehen. So, ich kann es sehen. Note that that transition back to the full infinitive happens no matter whether you're speaking in the first person, second person, third person, singular, plural, it doesn't matter. Ich kann es sehen. Wir können es sehen. Ihr könnt es sehen. It doesn't matter. But there's another kind of verb push that happens in subordinate sentence clauses. The subordinating conjunction, whether it's weil or ob or das or whatever it is, pushes the first verb in the subordinate clause to the end, but does not reconjugate it back to the full infinitive. It stays in its conjugated form. So if you want to say something like, you know that I see it. In German, that's du weißt, dass ich es sehe. We don't conjugate sehe back to the full infinitive sehen. It just gets pushed to the end as is. That's verb push type number 2. Okay, but hang on, because it gets a little bit uglier. Is it possible for both of these verb push types to happen in the same sentence? Yes, it is, and this is what we covered in episode 8. If you have a subordinating conjunction that introduces a subordinate sentence clause with more than one verb, we end up with both types of verb pushing happening in the same sentence clause. This can look really strange. So you know that I can see it would be du weißt, dass ich es sehen kann. What happened there? Let's take a look at that subordinate clause. First, can pushed sehe to the end and conjugated it back to the full infinitive sehen. That's verb push type number 1. But then das, the subordinating conjunction, pushed can to the end but didn't reconjugate it because subordinating conjunctions don't do that. That's verb push type number 2. And they both happened in the same sentence clause, and they happened in that order. So you get sehen can at the end of the sentence, and again you read them right to left. Okay, but hold on to your butts, because this can get really ugly if there are 3 verbs in the subordinate clause. So, you know that I will be able to see it. In German would be, du weißt, dass ich es sehen können werde. What happened there? Similar thing to before, it's just more verbs. Can pushed sehe to the end and conjugated it back to sehen. Werde pushed can to the end and conjugated it back to the full infinitive können. But then das, the subordinate conjunction, pushed werde to the end and did not reconjugate it. So you end up with sehen können werde, which again you read right to left, will be able to see. Okay. That's a review of what we covered in episode 8. Episode 8 covered that in much more detail, so if it's still a little fuzzy to you, go watch episode 8 and come back. And now we will discuss something that I just learned recently. Back in January on the Closemaster forums, I spotted something that I thought was a mistake. But it turns out it's not a mistake. There's another way of phrasing this in German. It's specific to the case where you have a subordinate clause with 3 verbs. Only subordinate clauses that have 3 verbs, you have this extra option. It turns out the auxiliary verb can go on either side of the verb cluster. And it's perfectly valid in German, therefore, to say, du weißt, dass ich es werde sehen können. It looks like a mistake because if you've read the grammar textbooks, if you've gone through those rules about, how do verbs get pushed to the end in German subordinate clauses, you expect werde to show up at the end. And normally it does, but there's another way of phrasing that, and that is to put werde in front of that verb cluster at the end. So werde sehen können, you can no longer read it right to left. Now you kind of have to jiggle it up a little bit, but it means the same thing. Those sentences are interchangeable. It's not stressing anything. It's not emphasizing anything. As far as I can tell, it's just a style change. It's how you decide to phrase it. There was a fantastic discussion thread on Closemaster in the forum section. One of the users there posted a brilliant comment with a bunch of examples of this. I'll post a link to that down in the description box below so you can check it out. But it's very good to have this in the back of your mind because you will occasionally see it and hear it in German. I've heard it at least 3 times since I learned this rule a few months ago, so it does pop up every now and then. Maybe not super common. I will say that the first phrasing here on the screen is probably more common than the second one, but they're both equally valid in German. Okay, pop quiz. Let's test your verb pushing knowledge. If I wanted to say in German, I'm not sure if I will be able to sell it tomorrow. How would I say that? Keeping in mind the rules we just went over for verb pushing. And I will point out that if in this context is ob, which is a subordinated conjunction. So, hit the pause button if you need more time. Hit the pause button if you need more time. Okay, let's review. Ich bin mir nicht sicher, ob ich das morgen verkaufen können werde, is the straightforward translation of that. Let's break it down. Can pushes verkaufe to the end and conjugates it back to the infinitive verkaufen. Then werde pushes can to the end and conjugates it back to the full infinitive können. But then ob, the subordinated conjunction, pushes werde to the end and does not reconjugate it because subordinated conjunctions use verb push type number 2, which doesn't do that. So we end up with ob ich das morgen verkaufen können werde. I will give you full marks if you got that. I will also give you full marks if you put werde on the other side of that verb cluster because it's equally valid. Ich bin mir nicht sicher, ob ich das morgen werde verkaufen können. It means the same thing. And I will give you sneaky extra bonus points if you omitted werde from the sentence altogether because it turns out we really don't need it. You can say in German, ich bin mir nicht sicher, ob ich das morgen verkaufen kann. I don't know if I can sell that tomorrow. You don't really need to to use explicit future tense there in either language. It's a bit more economical. But I will deduct 1,000,000 points if you moved can in front of the verb cluster at the end, because it's not valid. Ich bin mir nicht sicher, ob ich das morgen kann verkaufen is wrong. Why? Why is that wrong? Why can't we move that second verb in front of the verb cluster there? Well, because the subordinated conjunction now introduces a clause that only has 2 verbs. And remember, this exception only applies to subordinate clauses that have 3 verbs. It does not work if the subordinate clause only has 2 verbs. So keep that in the back of your mind. All right, that'll do it for today. We will see you next time on Learn German from What am I saying? That's the wrong channel, dum-dum. Try that again. 3, 2, 1. That's it for today. We will see you next time on Lernen und Fahren.